Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Danny. Glad to see you again, even on Zoom. So I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute. My name is Armine Ishkanian, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program, AFSE. I'm also the co-lead of the II's Politics of Inequality Research Program and a professor of social policy, but not there now. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled The Century of the Citizen, which is part of the II Inequalities seminar series. Today's speaker is Danny Sriskandarajah. Danny is currently Chief Executive of Oxfam GB, and will soon be taking up a new role as CEO of the New Economics Foundation. He was also recently visiting us at the III, where he carried out research as a visiting senior fellow. May I ask our online audience to please keep yourselves muted? As usual, there will be an opportunity for you to pose questions to the speaker following the presentation. I'll take questions, one from online and one from in the room. And before I hand over to Danny, Lisa kindly reminded me to announce that Dr. George Kunat has now joined officially the AFSE team as lifelong engagement lead. So congrats, George. Over to you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, Amina. Hello, everyone. Congratulations, George. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm in Nairobi this week, not for not one, but two separate conferences that are being held. So I'm sitting outside my hotel room in Nairobi. I hope the internet's going to stay stable and work out. I've got a backup plan, and fingers crossed. It's a real pleasure to be part of this series. I'm looking forward to the conversation because I'm going to share with you some early thinking that I was able to do while I was a visiting fellow at the Institute during the early part of the summer. And I just want to say a huge thank you to, there's lots of people I can see the backs of your heads who I was really grateful to spend time with over the summer. You were fantastic hosts at the Institute, and I felt hugely privileged to have some time away from a busy day job to just think and reflect, and to hang out with some pretty cool, inspiring folk. You sort of reignited my hope in the academy. I did a DPhil 20 years ago and left the academy because I felt frustrated that too many academics were focusing on very narrow, often irrelevant topics. And it was fantastic to come to the Institute and be part of a community of scholars who are activists and working on, some of the most important issues facing the world in a really thoughtful, robust way, but also in an inspiring way. So thank you for reaffirming my faith in the role of the academy. I worked on a few things while I was there. One of them is this project that's perhaps rather grandiloquently titled The Century of the Citizen. And I say that somewhat sheepishly because if I were an academic or when I was a graduate student teaching, if someone had submitted an essay called The Century of the Citizen and made the arguments I'm about to make, I'd probably dismiss most of what they had to say, saying this is, it's full of grand sweeping generalization. Where's your evidence? Why is this not more tightly argued? So I want you to bear with me as I share my thoughts and where I'm at. But I'm looking forward to constructive dialogue, criticism, if you will, because this is early work, but it's work that I'm particularly sort of passionate about. So the project called The Century of the Citizen came about, I suppose, because of my experience over the last 20 years of working in civil society, in charities, non-governmental organizations in the UK and elsewhere. And one thing that's becoming plainly clear to those of us who work particularly in sort of progressive, independent, rights-based organizations in civil society is the world is getting tougher. Independent, vocal civil society almost everywhere in the world is under huge amounts of pressure, and I'll get to that in a sec. But we're losing the battle to to win hearts and minds of populations around the world, that civil society is incredibly important, and instead, where our work around the world is being undermined by not just autocrats but even democrats who see our work as unpatriotic, as treacherous, civil disobedience as inconvenient at best, and deeply problematic at worst. So many of us who work in civil society fear that we are heading backwards on civic freedoms. But at the same time, the optimist in me thinks that actually there's something very precious that, when I do travel the world and meet activists and colleagues, there's something very precious and special about civic activism, this idea that citizenship isn't just a passive legal status, not a piece of paper or a passport that one carries, but it's a fundamental part of not just democratic life, but arguably human life. We're social beings. Throughout our own history, we've been very good at coming together for collective action, solving problems together. We've created systems and institutions and economic systems to organize how we do that. But I think at our heart, this notion that we are active, connected social animals is fundamental. And so I've been trying to deal with this sort of dilemma of the sort of pessimism that I and many others feel, coupled with this optimism that that inspires a lot of us. And why the century of the citizen framing is, when I look at the literature, not just the academic literature, but the sort of the literature coming out of independent civil society, particularly at the turn of the millennium, it felt like there was a huge amount of hope for how this century should have panned out, right? There was lots of people arguing that, humanity was on the cusp of, the end of history, if you will, that we were no longer subjects ruled over by monarchs. We weren't even just passive consumers in a capitalist system, but this was going to be the century in which we emerged as citizens, able to fulfill and realize our potential as active citizens. What was happening in many parts of the world post-Cold War, the rise of democracy, but also the rise of incomes, meant that more people in more parts of the world should have been able to have the basic wherewithal to be able to express their citizenship, be part of political communities in which democracy was on the rise. And of course, the arrival of the internet was heralded as a very optimistic development in human history. We're now going to be able to not just socialize on Facebook and reconnect with old school friends, but organize and mobilize in new and more powerful way, in cheaper way, in more global ways. And so there was a sense of optimism that I certainly felt, and it looks like when you look at the literature, certainly at the turn of the century, and especially the early years of the century, rise of civic protests, Occupy movement, if you remember, or the Arab revolutions, there was certainly, even in the first years of this century, I think a great deal of optimism that one might characterize as the optimism that this would become or be the century of the citizen. Sadly, it doesn't look like it's panning out that way. And there are lots of bits of evidence that suggest that we are, perhaps entering or in the middle of a very worrying period of human history. Take, for example, civic freedoms. So these are the three fundamental freedoms around expression, association, and assembly that are critical to civic life. Civic, as the organization I used to work for, produces a monitor, the Civicus Monitor, that looks at how these three freedoms are being realized around the world. It's a sort of real-time monitor of civic freedoms in 195 countries. And if you look at the findings that Civicus colleagues have been sharing, it's worrying, it's depressing. You know, a tiny number of countries are considered to be genuinely open in terms of civic freedoms. Some 3 billion people live in countries in which civic space or the civic freedoms are obstructed or fundamentally flawed. And even mature democracies have huge concerns. The United Kingdom, for example, was downgraded earlier this year on the Civicus Monitor because of what's happening around the policing bill, what was happening in terms of shutting down peaceful assembly, and so on. And the UK is one of a number of countries in which civic freedoms we worry about. Secondly, more broadly, there has been a democratic decline in many parts of the world. We have elected authoritarians who are, gripping power in some pretty vulgar and scary ways. In mature democracies, we have high and growing levels, or worrying levels of apathy, falling levels of trust and participation. And of course, we've seen in many parts of the world not just the rise of populism, but of a divisive politics that seems to be hollowing out the middle. And so you've got a sort of phenomenon that even if you're, sort of citizens aren't able to express themselves and connect and speak truth to power, but when they encounter a political system, there are all sorts of challenges. If you take the internet, I suspect I don't need to say very much about this. All of that optimism seems to be falling away as we face up to some deeply worrying things that are going on when it comes to digital freedoms. Our privacy is being compromised. The ability to organize and mobilize has been weaponized against people who dare to speak truth to power. I used to joke that, when I was a teenager wanting to organize a protest or a rally, I'd have to, physically, call people up one by one, ask them to come to a pub or a cafe to organize a protest. These days, it's so easy, so instant, so cheap to be able to do that, but it's also so easy, so cheap, so effective to surveil those people who do dare to mobilize, and particularly in restrictive regimes. I mentioned that some of the optimism in the late 20th century was around falling levels of extreme poverty, for example. In many parts of the world, people's real incomes were rising, and so therefore the optimism was that people wouldn't have to worry so much about where the next meal came from, and could therefore start to enjoy the benefits of what political life or civic life would hold for them. Sadly, that too seems to be in reverse. We've got economic inequality rising almost everywhere in the world, and poverty rising. Last year saw the greatest rise in extreme poverty since records began about 30 years ago. I think Chico's probably in the room. He's the expert on how you measure all of this, but it's really worrying stuff. And we have, yes, the world has made huge progress, but nearly half of the humans on the planet still live only on $6 a day, purchasing power parity adjusted. And so that's by no means a very comfortable income to be able to live a stable and predictable life in which one can enjoy civic freedoms. I'm talking to an audience interested in equality. We have some very worrying interrelationships between, for example, inequality and civic space. As Chomsky and others have argued, that when there is a concentration of power, there have been some examples in human history where there's been a sort of peaceful deconcentration. We saw it in the immediate aftermath of World War II. We saw it in East Asia, perhaps. But what can often happen is that the elites who've accumulated that wealth clamp down on other people's ability to protest that accumulation, that you have economic elites influencing the political system to shut down protest, to shut down civic freedoms, and to shut down sort of transparent, accountable operation of the political system. And similarly, again, I don't think I need to talk about this very much to this audience, but the relationship between sort of rising inequality and democracy itself. is also very, very problematic. That, you know, is it even possible to have a functioning democracy in a system, in an economic system, in which the economic power is being concentrated in the hands of a very few? And so there are, you know, real concerns that, far from this being the century of the citizen, that we're sleepwalking, hurtling into a deeply worrying era when it comes to those sort of fundamental freedoms and fundamental aspects of civic life across the world, not just in autocracies and non-functioning democracies. And so the project that I spent time while I was a visiting fellow was saying, well, how might we best reverse these? And here comes the broad sweeping generalizations and the sort of ambitious political statements. But I think there are 5 things that we, and when I say we, I mean activists, people who work in civil society, people who are interested in supporting and nurturing democratic life. I think there are 5 areas we need to be paying careful attention to, and ideally being propositional about how we do restore civic life and civic freedoms. And just to run through each very briefly, one is around the sort of the landscape in which citizens are organizing and mobilizing. I think there's a need to modernize and revamp civic infrastructure, finding new, better ways of organizing in the context that I've just described. Secondly, and perhaps not surprisingly, trying to navigate what the digital era might mean for notions of citizenship, or indeed the notion of humanity itself in the coming decades. Thirdly, trying to find ways of promoting a more liquid, a more participatory democracy beyond many of the sort of Victorian notions of democratic systems that we see in many parts of the world. Fourthly, a priority around the economy, trying to democratize the economy so that we're empowered even when we're in the various ways in which we participate in the capitalist system. And finally, just paying attention to democratizing the global realm, something that seems often neglected certainly in the sort of activism that I've encountered in recent years. So let me take each of those in turn briefly, and then we can hopefully have a conversation. First, new ways of organizing. I think this might seem odd coming from someone who has the privilege of working in one of the largest NGOs in the world. Oxfam these days, we're 21 legal entities spread across the world with operations in about 80 countries. We have an annual income of about €1 billion. We have brand recognition all around the world, something like 99% prompted brand recognition in the UK. We've established ourselves in this last 80 or so years we've been around as a formidable and powerful civil society entity. But in some ways, the formalization of civil society in this way is itself part of the problem. And so let me explain. I mean, I think this, in many parts of the world, particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries, there's been this notion of a registered charity. In England, it's been around since Queen Elizabeth I and the Statute of Charitable Uses some 400 years ago, this notion that there were these entities in society that would be there for the pursuit of social good, of public good. And they would be called registered charities or 501c3s or whatever else. Different countries have different ways of registering and defining what these charitable entities are. And that's in some ways served us well in many parts of the world, because it has created a professionalized, bureaucratized, formal bit of civil society. But today it does feel like we need to almost sort of level the playing field, if you will, in civil society, and find new and better ways of nurturing informal activism, of social movements, of digital networks, of counter of outsider forces, if you will, in civil society that are willing and able to challenge the system. And so I think there is a need to rethink how we play to the diversity of civic life. I suppose my argument here is we've ended up privileging and prioritizing certain bits of civil society. That's been great, has had its benefits, but we in the coming era, I think we need to find new ways of organizing and mobilizing. Some of that has to be digitally led and digitally first. And there have been some powerful examples of citizens coming together in the digital world. Avaz is a platform that I suspect many of us will know very well, founded in 2007, now having something like 70 or 80 million online users, responsible for some amazing campaigns that have held power to account, and a fantastic demonstration of online activism that I hope goes beyond the sort of challenge that's often made of a sort of slacktivism or clicktivism, where many people complain that what used to be an onerous and important commitment that one made to civic life is now just a click away, and it's become a sort of rather shallow activity. I remain convinced that we can and must find new digital first ways in which we can organize and mobilize. And if you go down that path, it also takes you to some exciting potential ways in which we might even structure civil society. Some of you will be familiar with things like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. These are examples, they're fledgling examples in many cases, but examples of using open ledger systems, transparent systems like blockchain to create new governance systems that themselves are far more democratic and participatory, even for civic organizations. And so the argument here, I suppose, is that if we are to make this the century of the citizen, we need to find better ways of democratizing civil society itself, playing to the diversity of civic life, and sharing and leveling the playing field. If you're sharing power and leveling the playing field, even within civic life. So that's one ingredient, if you will, in terms of how I think we need to sort of invest and protect civic life. Secondly, what happens what is happening in the digital era, and how might we nurture civic life online? And I was struck by something that Ev Williams, the co-founder of Twitter, said many years ago, or X as it's now called. And I don't know whether Elon Musk would agree with what Ev Williams said, but he once said, "I thought once everybody could speak freely and exchange info and ideas, the world would automatically be a better place." And he says, but I was wrong about that. So, and I thought that's a fabulous example of, again, this sort of optimism that was around Silicon Valley and the sort of digital world 20, 30 years ago, or as recently maybe 10, 15 years ago, when it really did feel like the sort of a really new frontier. There was this, another artifact of that era was something called the Declaration of Cyber Independence that was penned also a decade or so ago. And the idea was that we were building a new cyber utopia in which we as citizens were going to be able to connect, communicate, exchange info and ideas. And separate from, if you will, the constraints and contradictions of the real world. And as we all know, that's not how it's turning out. It probably is never going to turn out that way. But I suppose more worryingly, the fear is that instead of the sort of utopia, we're hurtling towards a sort of cyber dystopia in which actually things are going to be deeply problematic. And I suppose for me, what's important here is to in some ways do the basics, like leveling the playing field on digital access. It is a tragedy that there are several billion people around the planet still who aren't even connected to reliable internet on a daily basis. And so we're worryingly heading towards a sort of two-tier world in which some of us are able to have conversations like we are today, but many of us aren't even able to get onto the sort of first step of the digital ladder. Another basic or fundamental ingredient is, really being clear about protecting privacy and other human rights online. But then we get into some really interesting terrain about what might the digital era look like if we were to make this a century of the citizen. And there are three things that come to mind for me that I think are worth exploring and investing in. One is around what do the public duties in the online space look like? I think, one lesson of recent years is we've allowed digital entrepreneurs to create, in some cases, the biggest corporate entities humanity has ever seen, without really placing a duty of care on them in terms of the harms that they are creating or responsible for or willfully neglecting. And many of us have spent time thinking about how do we regulate the digital sphere. For me, the lesson from the emerging lesson from my work is, well, one way to cut it is to think about how do we ensure the public the duty of care, if you will, to individuals, to citizens, that duty of care is maintained for anyone who controls or owns bits of digital life. And let me explain. It's sort of, if you take a social media company, it's very tempting to think we need to sort of do heavy regulation to protect this harm or prevent that harm. I think that's going to be deeply problematic given the pace of change of emerging technologies, including, of course, artificial intelligence. But I think that a more sensible policy approach is to sort of think about what obligations do we place on those who own or control bits of digital infrastructure to prevent harm, whether that's harm to individuals in terms of mental health, or harm in terms of protecting civic rights or human rights more broadly. And I think there's scope there for us to be. We have to move quickly because I think it does feel like we're still in the sort of wild west of digital regulation while things are changing quickly. A second ingredient is what some people call the Digital Geneva Convention, and it's an idea that I find very attractive. And it's a very simple one, which is, in the real world we have the Geneva Conventions, amazing bits of international legal normative architecture that are now over 100 years old, that effectively protect civilians and civic infrastructure during times of war and conflict. And I think it's becoming abundantly clear the world needs something like that for what's happening in the digital world. We're already seeing some really terrifying examples of states and non-state actors, targeting civilian infrastructure, the National Health Service in the UK, the nuclear energy system in the US, that are being targeted by cyber attacks, probably from state-sponsored actors. And so what are those new norms and new rules that will help protect civilians and civic life in the coming years? And finally, and perhaps most tentatively, there's the question of, or set of questions around, what does civic life look like in the metaverse? And I use the metaverse carefully because there's many people who seem to define this in many ways. For me, it's a sort of emerging set of technologies that are coming together. Obviously, the web 3.0, as some people call it, augmented reality, virtual reality, systems in which more and more aspects of our life might be spent entirely online, entirely in a digital environment, some of it is some really interesting things happening at the moment in Seoul and in Korea. The local authorities have effectively created a one-stop digital shop for council services, for city council services in the metaverse. So no longer do you have to sort of go into the city council to get a form filled or a service to access a service, and you don't even have to now call. You can just use whatever access point you have into the metaverse and be served online. It's a small but interesting example of how sort of public authorities or public bodies might look and feel in the metaverse. But there's some really fascinating, again, perhaps terrifying things happening. I mean, let's start with the notion of citizenships. There are, I think, Palau, the small island state in the Pacific, is a good example of a country that's literally selling digital identities, so that in the world of cryptocurrencies, when you need to establish your digital identity, Palau, a tiny little island state, has been auctioning the right to use your own, to create your digital identity in Palau, regardless of where in the physical world you live. Why does this matter? It matters because it's increasingly clear that the sort of sets of norms and rules, the regulatory and legislative framework that regulates our sort of physical life, because we happen to be legally resident or a citizen of a country, might remain important in some ways, but if you're spending increasing amounts of your time, your effort, your money online in the metaverse, it might be even more important, or what might become even more important is, of course, where you hold your digital citizenship, and the two need not be connected. So it's sort of a very practical example of how the very fundamental questions of even the sort of the basics of citizenship are being upended, or potentially will be upended. And of course, in all of this, you would come back to in the metaverse. What will it mean to be human? How do we establish our human identity in a world of artificial intelligence? And of course, then you get to a set of other questions around how do you maintain your rights, your dignity in that emerging sphere. So lots of important challenges there. But I think what's clear is that we've got these sort of core principles that we've tried to protect and nurture in recent decades, or even in the last century or two, that I think just remain just as relevant, but we need to quickly and in a thoughtful and robust way adapt them for a rapidly changing digital environment in which citizenship, both in the sort of the paper you might carry or the bit of code you might have, and the ability to express these fundamental human rights. A third area is around liquid democracy, I suppose, is the phrase that appeals to me. And the thinking here, again, it should be rather obvious. Many of the mechanisms that we've come to rely on as fundamental to democracy feel deeply problematic. Political parties, general elections every few years, a parliamentary system in which elected officials are supposed to represent the views of the electorate. Now, all of these are fantastic innovations of humanity, I think, but all of them feel problematic. And some of this is not particularly new. I think it was George Washington who was early as 1796, lambasted political parties for allowing cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men to subvert the power of people. Of course, you might not be able to say that of political parties today, or maybe you can. But we live in a world in the UK, for example, where tiny numbers of people actually belong to political parties, far less than 1% of the adult population, and yet they dominate political life in a way that elected representatives remain arbiters of many a decision in democratic life. And I think we can and we must do better. And there are many other more interesting ways of promoting, of combining representative democracy with more direct and participatory forms. And we've seen some fascinating examples. We will know about the use of citizens' assemblies around the world. We saw it in Ireland a few years ago when it came to the repeal of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. France earlier this year in terms of for assisted death. This is, these are examples using, in this case, the citizen assembly methodology, getting 99 or so randomly selected citizens to come and deliberate together on these really tough decisions that society as a whole is grappling with, and which elected representatives don't seem to be willing to or able to sort of make inroads in building a consensus. And so I think there are tools like that. Participatory budgeting is a technique that has been used to bring citizens into decision-making around the allocation. Community foundations and systems of, again, participatory allocation of resources so that you can, involve people at every level, not just at the sort of high level decisions about big strategic political questions, but more into a collaborative decision making, even on a more applied basis. So I think we can and must do better in terms of how democratic life will evolve, and that's important because I think part of the diagnosis is that the systems in many parts, democratic systems in many parts of the world, have taken for granted that we will just be sort of interested, active citizens. But in fact, what we're seeing, there's emerging worrying evidence that the sort of moderate middle in many mature democracies are disengaging. People are feeling they've got no time to engage in these processes, or even worse, that there's no point in engaging with these processes because they don't see that their active involvement in democratic life today is going to make much of a difference. And add to that, of course, this idea that we see, we have the more extreme ends of political debates being far more vocal and using, especially online methodologies, to be able to crowd out more moderate voices. And so I think we need to, reinvent democracy or democratic life for the rest of the 21st century. Fourthly, and penultimately, what's happening in the economy, for me, there's a sort of, we've had a false promise of what a modern, global, digitally led capitalism was going to deliver for us. And the promise in some ways is best exemplified for me anyway, about the sort of, the promise of a new intimate social contract. Part of what seemed to have been exciting about what was happening, particularly in the digital economy, was that we were going to have far more intimate relationships between producers and consumers, between all of us as economic actors, through these methodologies that we're able to connect. Take Uber, for example, or any ride-sharing technique. You weren't just going to get a more efficient system of finding a ride when and where you needed it, but you had this sort of intimate relationship with the person who was providing that service. You knew their name, you could rate them, they could rate you. You were on a crowdsourced platform where you could see who else was there, and or even my favorite or least favorite recent example is, I bought a pair of shoes from Nike.com. I had to sign up to become a member with Nike. I don't know what that means. And I get an email when it's my birthday congratulating me and wishing me a happy birthday and offering me a 10% discount. And I thought, this is an example of this idea that somehow in the sort of contemporary capitalism, that there is this sort of, a more intimate social contract between me and the shareholders of Uber or the owners of Nike. And it's proving dangerously false because these are products or manifestations of an economic system that is driving inequality. It's extractive at an unprecedented scale in human history. And so you're promised this extremely instant and intimate set of relationships, but what we're actually having behind that is a failure of all of those dogmas that have driven economic policy and thinking in recent decades. And each of them, shareholder democracy, trickle-down politics, liberalization, privatization, the Washington Consensus, in some ways promised that people would be empowered, that the workers, that citizens, that shareholders would be empowered and active participants in the economic order. But it's proving worryingly untrue. And I think, again, there's an urgent need to reset some of our economic assumptions, to put workers, consumers, citizens at the heart of economic life. And how do we do that? To me, this is in some ways the most obvious areas, because almost all of the examples of what we could do are around, and in some cases have been around for centuries. Take cooperatives, for example. I think today there are several million, 3 million or so cooperatives around the world, like accounting for 1 in 10 all employed people around the world. Cooperatives aren't perfect and don't address every economic challenge, but are a tried and tested model of empowering workers in a better way than other forms of capital ownership. But even in more traditional forms, we're seeing some interesting examples. Yes, hi.
Just so we have at least 15, 20 minutes to giving you 5 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. I've got one more aspect to talk about. So just to underline the point that I think in terms of sort of democratizing how the economy works, I think there are plenty of examples. A recent good one was what Patagonia is doing. You will have seen sort of the outdoor clothing brand, which wants to remain a for-profit company, has changed its ownership structure so that 2% of stock holdings, the voting stock, is held in the Patagonia Purpose Trust, where those people who are holding the shares are tasked with driving profit, but with the values of Patagonia. But 92% of the stock is there as the holdfast collective to spread all dividend income to invest in biodiversity and protecting the planet. It's an interesting example of trying to show that a large global for-profit brand can still deliver better outcomes. And finally, in terms of the global decision making, for me, one of the most frustrating things about the moment in human history that we're in today is that almost all of the big challenges the world faces, whether it's climate change or public health in the face of pandemic, require effective global decision making. And while you could say, it's fantastic that we've had 70, 80 years of an international system, a rules-based international system that has worked better than many had expected in the 1940s or 50s. You could also argue that we've had a failure after failure in leaning into to some of these challenges and seeing effective decision making, underwhelming action on climate change, or deeply dangerous inaction on climate change, if you will. Take vaccine hoarding. The international system just couldn't manage a thorough egalitarian response to the COVID-19 pandemic because no one was willing or able to enforce or design and enforce a set of rules that would deliver global public goods effectively or quickly enough. And of course, we've got a system, an international governance system that's still, very much a legacy of the mid-20th century, entrenching power in the hands of a small number of states. And I've, in the 20 or so years I've been in and around the UN system, for example, I've never seen it this bad. I think not only are many institutions sort of just don't have the resources, they're caught in the sort of crossfire between, a rising China, deliberately mischievous Russia, and a West that doesn't quite know how to come up with a coherent or clear response. Why does this matter to the century of the citizen? I think it matters because there's an opportunity to reinvent how the sort of international order can work, putting citizens more at the heart of how that works. How could that work? It could be as simple as, rethinking the way that the international system currently looks at civil society. More often than not, that's through a system of a formal accreditation, NGOs accredited to come and attend UN meetings. It sort of formalizes and bureaucratizes the system I was talking about earlier, and we can do much better than that. There are many more effective ways of garnering civic voice. We've had examples, for example, in the European Union, of citizen initiatives, plebiscites, if you will. Why couldn't we have a world citizens initiative where, once a petition or plebiscite got a requisite number of signatures in a requisite number of countries, that the international system, the UN, for example, is compelled to discuss and debate the topic? Why couldn't we have a UN parliamentary association, a sort of upper house, if you will, in which parliamentarians from around the world are elected? Or one better, why couldn't we have a People's Assembly at the UN, a sort of, again, an upper house where the General Assembly might be one nation state, one vote, but the upper house might be directly elected or appointed on a proportional basis from around the world based on populations. And so there are some really interesting creative ideas of democratizing the global space, and through it, I hope, improving the quality of decision making at the global level. Let me stop there. Thank you, Armine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights, Danny. Really, I've got so many questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I'm actually going to open it up to the floor. I'll start with online, if there's any online questions. No. Okay, so I'll start with in the room. Fabrizio, Emma, do you want to stand and then Chico?
Hi, Danny. Thanks for this interesting talk. We put all these issues in the big picture in a very interesting way. I have a question, this national comment. But it's indeed a disagreement with you on a minor point that you mentioned, and I'd like to see how if you agree or not with my point. You mentioned in the beginning of your talk the risks that the rise of populism has posed to democracies in many regions in the world. I think this rings true to many of us. But there is an issue that sometimes I think we may be overselling populism as a risk. What I mean by that is, if you look at the United States, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are populists, but they are very different from each other, right? So, and there is an interesting op-ed published in the LSE blog, I think in 2017, when a visiting professor said that we are all, she used the same words, we are all maybe overselling populism. The risk is actually right-wing ideology, because when you look at what's going on around the world, so to speak, most of the populists that have been taking over, have been winning elections and taking over governments, they are right-wing populists. There are some left-wing populists as well, but they are by far a minority. So my point is, in talking a lot about populism and not talking about right-wing or conservatives or authoritarians specifically, we may be hollowing out the discussion on ideology and the place of ideology in this conversation, right? And it's not too difficult to see the difference that makes having a right-wing and a left-wing government, even if they are moderate left-wing governments. For instance, no one would challenge that Lula, who is a very moderate left-wing politician, is very different from Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or again, Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump in the US. Who knows how the world would be if Bernie Sanders had been elected the president of the United States a couple of years ago, and the list of examples go on and on. So perhaps when we're talking about populism, we are doing what you mentioned at some point, that the middle of the political spectrum is just vanishing and not engaging in the conversation, because we may be focusing on the wrong side or not the most important side of this conversation. So I'd like this just to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Danny, do you want to respond?
Yeah, if it's easy. I mean, so just briefly to say, yeah, I think for me, the concern is really about where you left it. The sort of the danger is, and exactly, I agree with your point, you can be populist at either end of the spectrum or any end of the spectrum, but if the implication of that populism is that you sort of hollow out the moderate middle, and when I say hollow out, either because people are sort of drawn to the extreme because of the way that sort of political ideology is going, or because society starts to lose the ability to have more moderate conversations, the sort of bridging capital, if you will, that Putnam talked about, the idea that, again, for civic life, if you take my analysis around sort of how do we support and nurture civic life, I think you need, civic life, I don't know how the causality runs here, but, if you have a political or a polity that's being, fractured, you start to undermine the quality of civic life. Many people say that in the US, there are very few civic institutions that bring people from different political spectrums together for shared endeavor. there's examples like community foundations that still exist in a few parts of the US, but sort of civic life itself has started to replicate a more polarized sort of formal political life. And I think that's worrying if from the point of view of nurturing civic life and involving more people and making them feel safer and more empowered to be able to engage in civic life. Thanks.
Thanks. Kiko, I saw your hand, but I'm going to take one online and then I'll come to you. Lila, online.
Hi, hello everyone. Hi from Ghana. Really interesting presentation. That was lots of food for thought. I was very busy rapidly scribbling notes, so very insightful. But I mean, my question really is around these sort of very large professionalized charities, and obviously they may not be profit making, but I would observe that in many ways, in many of their behaviors, a kind of part of what we might notice is a bit of a problem. And in particular, I think observed in recent years that they have kind of paid attention to some of those methods of engaging the grassroots. They've paid attention to the language of participation. And honestly, I think I would say that in some cases, I see them encroaching on that grassroots user-led civic space, and they're taking up that civic space in terms of funding, in terms of the, being the ones to sort of give the views and all of that. But then also in terms of that knowledge production and all of those issues. So I'm just wondering, apart from maybe closing them all down, which obviously I'm not seriously suggesting, but I'm just wondering how we would address this kind of challenge.
Thanks, Lila. And just to give a context to Danny, Lila is one of our current AFSI fellows.
Right, great. So I suppose I agree with you, Lila, in terms of that's exactly the risks that we've got in sort of civil society, on the civil society landscape, a sort of unhealthy level of inequality. And while in the market space, you could argue that size and scale or agglomeration can deliver positive externalities or impacts, there is a worry that if, especially as you say, in terms of resources or profile or media attention or policymaker time, you can have a very unhealthy concentration of all of that in the hands of a relatively few set of civil society actors. And I think the promising news, I'm here in Nairobi at an Oxfam conference. Certainly within the likes of Oxfam, we're trying to face up to that. We're trying to say, how do the larger bits of civil society play a more responsible role in terms of nurturing, civic life, supporting partners, helping to nurture a more resilient civil society across the world in countries where we work in. And that means, being less of a supertanker and a more of a dockyard, I suppose, is how I see it. That we take, the world is a better place with these strong civic institutions, but it'll be an even better place if they play more of a nurturing role, or more of a dockyard role. And part of the challenge, I think, is, I think you hinted at it, or maybe you're more explicit at it, which is, the sort of the dynamic, the logic of much of organized civil society is increasingly about delivery, that it's about sort of getting the job done because institutional donors demand it, their log frames require it, and even public supporters, we think, are expecting us to sort of deliver, tangible impacts. And that instinct isn't bad, but my worry is I often say the sort of science of delivery is killing the art of transformation, which is your point, I think, about the instinct to be more participatory, to be more co-creative or collaborative, whatever you want to call it, rubs up against this instinct to be sort of top-down, log frame led, delivery led. And that is also another tension that plagues a lot of civil society. And not even just in international NGOs. When I spend time with those peers who work in large domestic civil society organizations across the world, they have exactly the same challenges that they're facing. So that's what I mean about taking the best of the civil society landscape and updating it and repurposing it with this idea of a more egalitarian landscape, or the objective of more egalitarian landscape. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny.
Hi, Danny. Great to see you. again. Pity that you're not here. I hope you're enjoying Nairobi. Thanks for the great talk. Very, very insightful, very provocative. Let me try and provoke you a little bit as well. So there was a sense I had is that, you know, if I were interested in the century of the citizen in the sense of the role of civic associations, the role of NGOs, the role of activists and community organizations, broadly speaking, people who might think of ourselves as we here in this room, sort of progressive people, maybe even what we used to call left-wing people. The problem, you know, to me, the elephant in the room, the thing that's missing is that a whole bunch of people that we wanted to represent, people who see themselves as voiceless, who may be poor or middle class, not so much your moderate middle, but a disgruntled middle, no longer recognize us in any way as speaking for them. In fact, they see us as, you know, just another side. You know, there's the Tories, there's Labour, they're all there. There's the Democrats, there's the conventional Republicans, there's Oxfam, and there's the vote bank. We're all overeducated, you know, people fancy talking about sexual identity issues and migration and so on. And so the people who vote for Erdogan and support Erdogan are the people that the Turkish left wanted to represent. They're all in Anatolia. I'm simplifying. They're poor, right? They are people that we'd like to represent, and they support Erdogan. Similarly, you know, in the US, we have a large minority, 30–40% of the people who, no matter how many indictments Trump is responding to, will support him because he is against the sort of overeducated, you know, left, sort of Oxfam, vote bank, all the same to them. We see ourselves as perhaps opposed to one another, but it's all the same to them. And I think there's elements of this in India, where the debate used to be about Dalits and now it's about Muslims. There's elements of that in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, all over the place. So basically, you know, we were supposed to be the vanguard. Remember the term vanguard, revolutionary vanguard? Well, we've lost our followers. You know, our followers think we're ridiculous and support a bunch of authoritarian right-wingers. What'd you make of that?
I was expecting you to be provocative, and you have delivered. So, well, first of all, I suppose the way you put it, before we get to the point you were making, Chico, I think that I suppose a more basic point that I'm making is that, you know, if you define civil society as the sort of the space outside the state and outside the market in which people organize and mobilize, you know, for collective action, which is the sort of civicist definition, many other people have used it. If you take that definition, I suppose the first order argument I'm making is that civic life is losing out to, you know, to increasingly authoritarian state structures and dominant market systems that are disempowering us, whether as consumers or as workers. And so that's the first order answer. But I suppose then you're right. Within civic life, the second critique is that we've created institutions that themselves don't feel particularly democratic, and do, as you know, end up being, you know, becoming seen as part of the problem, that they're elitist and out of touch, they're self-serving or patronizing and extractive. And that is, again, you know, I can assure you that that is a live conversation within the larger bits of civil society. It's certainly something we talk a lot about in Oxfam at the moment. Again, that maybe that's a symptom of the fact that many bits of civil society, or many of these institutions themselves, have formalized and bureaucratized, and with that comes systems of hierarchy and power that end up feeling disempowering to people who are supposed to, you know, be your you know, your supporters, but the promising news is I don't think there's a shortage of civil society formations that are able to muster support, that can inspire remarkable numbers of people to get behind them. Not all of them are progressive, some of them are reactionary forces, but I think that, you know, that I would hold as constant. There are bits of civil society that are able to inspire and evoke support, but they just feel disconnected between the sort of established bits of civil society and these newer, less formal, more digital, sometimes spontaneous bits of civic life. Again, for better or for worse, left or right, but you don't seem the sort of the bridges, the connective tissue doesn't seem particularly good even within the civil society landscape. And any institution in society, in every society, I think, in the coming years and decades, needs to just be, the standards and expectations around transparency, participation, democratic engagement, all of that will have higher demands on all of us, regardless of whether you're the World Bank or Oxfam or a government agency, or hopefully a corporate or for-profit entity as well. And I suppose that's my point there, that you've got to seen through this angle of civic life, which is where I've been spending, that to me is another way of seeing the challenge that you could, and we can cut it in different ways. From my lens, that's the sort of the biggest set of challenges that we're facing at the moment.
Thanks, Danny. We're at the end of our time. There's, I think, quite a lot more to discuss, but I am mindful that you are at a conference and people here also have to go to class and other meetings. So it's been an absolute pleasure for me to welcome you back to III and to chair today's event. Thanks so much for your presentation, and thank you to everyone in the audience, both online and in the room. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.